Cyber warfare.
You also could be somebody sitting on that bed that weighs 400 pounds, okay?
Cyber and cyber warfare.
I have a son.
Cyber
He has computers.
warfare.
He is so good with these computers. It's unbelievable.
Cyber
As far as the
warfare.
cyber, I agree.
Computer.
We are all about zeros and ones on this episode of With All Due Respect. It's been less than 24 hours since Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump faced off on that Long Island debate stage, and both candidates are now back out on the trail already. After many, in the media especially, declared Clinton the winner from last night, the Democratic nominee took a victory lap in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Did anybody see that debate last night? Oh, yes. One down, two to go. And when I confronted him with the reasons why he won't release his tax returns, and I got to that point where I said, well, maybe he's paid zero, he said that makes him smart. Now, if not paying taxes makes him smart, what does that make all the rest of us?
Donald Trump has also been claiming victory. That was the main thrust of his talking points when he came in an unprecedented move into the spin room last night to talk to reporters, including that hardworking journalist. Trump and his team are trying to mitigate some of the fallout from criticism of his debate performance, or as some people call it, making excuses.
I mean, I had some hostile questions. He didn't ask her about the emails at all. He didn't ask her about her scandals. He didn't ask her about the Benghazi deal. He didn't ask her about a lot of things that she should have been asked about. I mean, you know, there's no question about it. You know, when you look at it, you watch the last four questions. He hit me on
Boom.
Bertha. He hit me on a housing deal from many years ago that I settled with
1973.
with no recourse. You know, they were leaving all of her little goodies out. Those questions are not answerable in a positive light. I had a problem with a microphone that didn't work. I don't know if you saw that in the room, but my microphone was terrible. I wonder, was it set up that way on purpose? My microphone in the room, they couldn't hear me. You know, it was going on and off.
Wow.
Which isn't exactly great. I wonder if it was set up that way, but it was terrible. It was on and off, and it was much lower than hers.
Okay.
I don't want to believe in conspiracy theories, of course, but it was much lower than hers, and it was crackling.
Oh, no, Donald Trump would never want to believe in a conspiracy theory. Anyway, here's what Clinton had to say about that, all of that, during a Hill Force One gaggle this morning.
What about his stamina? What about his stamina?
Anybody who complains about the microphone is not having a good night.
Okay. There is another trick that Donald Trump likes to use when he feels like he's not being treated fairly by the media. He likes to talk about the polls.
I think we did very well. We won virtually every poll, except for CNN. And nobody watches CNN. But we won almost every single poll, CBS and Drudge and Slate and Time Magazine and all of them, right? We won all of them. So that was a great.
Oh, he won all of them, especially that CBS poll, which doesn't actually exist because CBS didn't do a post-debate poll. And those others were, in fact, online surveys. The most credible post-debate poll of the bunch was, in fact, that CNN ORC survey that Trump mentioned, which found that 62% of voters said Clinton had a better night. So, Mark, not a good day for Donald Trump, not a particularly good night last night. Do you believe at this point it would do him good politically to just admit that he lost and start shaping up for the next debate?
I'm stipulating that there's a difference between what is and what ought to be. And I think this morning I thought he should say, you know, it was my first time debating, you know, I didn't like the way the questions went, but I'm going to do better next time. But now I don't think so. I think his supporters, you know, Rush Limbaugh said he won. I think as brazen as it is and as counterfactual to a lot of how people experience the debate, I think he should just tough it through, pretend it didn't happen, and hope that it doesn't impact the polls, in which case the national polls and the battleground state polls, in which you can just say, hey, I didn't lose.
I don't like giving Donald Trump advice about what to do or what not to do. I mean, again, we'll talk about it some more. You know, he plainly lost the debate. You know, there are examples in the past of candidates and campaigns back with Bush in 2004, with Obama in 2012, where the campaign basically didn't come out and say, we lost, but basically said, yeah, he didn't have a good night and we got to do better next time. And that helped them with their credibility with the media. I think it would help Trump with his credibility with the media, but the credibility with the mainstream media is not how Donald Trump advances himself politically. And the big difference to me between this and 2012, when Barack Obama failed in Denver in the first debate, he confronted mass panic among his supporters. He had to admit that he lost and that he would do better the next time because Democrats are freaking out. Trump fans are not freaking out. Trump fans saw a different debate than we saw last night. They think he won.
Some elite Republicans aren't happy, but what saved him, and the reason I don't think he has to, for his own good, say he lost, is there's no soundbite moment. There's a lot of little moments during the night which will continue to haunt him, and I predict will show up in Democratic ads. But there's no Rick Perry oops. There's no Gerald Ford, Poland isn't under Soviet domination. And therefore, as much as there was buildup to the debate, as much as people are still going to be talking about it by the end of the week on some level, I just don't think he has to turn the page in the narrative to say, I lost, let's move on. He can just, as I said, just kind of muscle through Trump style and say, I won, here's all the reasons I won. And hope, as I said, the polls don't suggest he lost.
Yeah, I have a feeling they might, though.
All right, so what about Hillary Clinton? What does she need to do now? What can she do to capitalize on what was a strong debate performance from last night? I ask you, John Heilman.
She's doing it. She's been doing it all day today. She's been out. Like, you're right that there was not a big moment like that where Trump said something, a glaring thing. But it's what she's now doing is she's highlighting those moments in order to try to keep that narrative going. I think particularly on the question of his taxes, where I thought her performance was brilliant last night by going through a series of hypotheticals, asking the question, having him not deny the questions, suggestions she was making, has now opened the door to that issue. We saw him last night take the bait on a lot of issues and make factual misstatements, screw various things up over the course of the night. She and her team now are amplifying those mistakes through the media and can keep this thing alive for several more days, I think, on that basis.
At least in social media and targeted media.
Yeah.
My second favorite Haley Barbour expression in politics, good gets better and bad gets worse. Right. She had a great day today. She did a gaggle on the plane with her reporters, and she was talking about being optimistic and joking with them and just as relaxed as I've seen her in a while. And then she did that rally. We showed a clip from it before. Again, she's enjoying the win, not gloating about it, not going over the top about it, but she is surfing the success she had last night. It's put her in a good mood. And, while Republicans aren't panicking, Democrats are super happy, and she knows that.
Here's the thing you can tell about candidates, and we're going to talk about the campaigns in a second and how they've tried to frame this thing, but even with candidates, you can tell. When a candidate feels they've won and is being judged to have won, they have that kind of look of confidence and that look of buoyancy. Donald Trump, we made the point in the screen in our segment here before, Trump, if Trump had won the debate, he would not be talking about the moderator. He wouldn't be talking about the microphone. It's a window into his psyche. He's tacitly admitting, although he'll never admit it explicitly, I don't think, he's tacitly admitting that he lost the debate because he's blaming things. He's making excuses. She right now is on a little bit of a roll, so we'll see how long it can last.
Confidence matters so much.
Yes.
And today, he's still confident because he's always confident, but she has got a lot of confidence off that.
More than she's had in weeks, I would say. Okay, so we got pretty dizzy, Mark and I did, from all the spinning that occurred in the Hofstra University debate spin room last night. Since then, both campaigns have dispatched staff, surrogates, and running mates to flood the airwaves with their talking points. So let's take a look at a sampling of what Team Trump has been saying about last night.
He took her on full square.
Donald Trump took command of the stage, and I think the American people saw his leadership qualities.
I was glad that he was polite and a gentleman to her, particularly at the end when he pulled the biggest punch of all.
I thought his restraint at the end was absolutely remarkable. She was just sort of programmed Hillary.
She gave us the canned scripted responses. She obviously was over-prepared, and she wanted to make sure we heard every single scripted moment.
So that was the Trump song, and now we'll take a listen to the tune that the Clinton chorus has been singing very joyfully all day today.
I thought that Hillary Clinton was prepared. Donald Trump was incoherent.
I think he came on stage grossly unprepared. He then kind of unraveled and came apart during the course of the debate. And I think he disqualified himself on every level.
Hillary answered questions, and Donald avoided them. And Hillary told the truth, and Donald told some whoppers. It really showed her off as prepared to be commander-in-chief and president.
She came there ready to talk about the future, not to just sit there and insult and whatever Donald Trump called that whining that he was doing.
I don't think Donald Trump can be president. He does not have the temperament.
So, Mark, this all matters in some sense. People make fun of spinmeisters, but the truth is how the media determines who did well, who didn't do well, matters a lot. So, in terms of how these two campaigns have handled this, who's making their case better? How are they handling it?
I mean, I think this is an area where technical proficiency and size matters, and planning. The Clinton campaign is learning from the Obama template about how to aggressively be out and have surrogates on all forms of media, and they filled the space. I actually think, given that the Trump team is so much smaller, that they're so much less experienced in most of the positions, and the fact that they were playing the weaker hand, I actually don't think they did a bad job of trying to create the impression that, you know, the red team says this, the blue team says this. Right. Clinton people did better, but the Trump people did surprisingly well.
They have done a decent job at preventing the panic among their supporters and not seeing their supporters flipping out, which is an important thing. But, you know, you can really tell, just we were talking about candidates a second ago, you can tell a team, we've covered a lot of debates over a lot of years, you know, right in that spin room, the Clinton campaign was out before the debate was over, and they were not only arguing that she won, but you could tell they believed it. The Trump campaign came out much later, and although they somewhat kind of gamely tried, bottom line, in various off-the-record conversations, background conversations, you could tell that they knew that they had been beaten, and they didn't have that look in their eyes.
The Clinton people, I mean, they were barely trying to spin. Like, right. I'd walk past them, they would just be like, hey, what's going on? There was no attempt. They were happy to let the candidate's performance speak for itself. I will say the Clinton people are at, like, you know, fighting readiness. It'd be interesting to see, not just if Trump does better in the subsequent debates, but does this operation improve and learn from this? Because, like I said, there are lots of people involved who've just never done this before, right. and certainly not at this level.
Yeah, almost everyone on that Clinton team has worked on a presidential campaign and has had to go out into spin rooms before and talk to reporters. Literally almost everyone, and it matters.
And I think it is still the case, or at least close to it, that the Clinton people have more people doing social media and communications than Trump has employees. Yeah. At least pretty close. All right, up next.
True.
What Donald J. Trump is saying about a former Miss Universe, it's out of this world. We'll be right back.
One of the sharpest barbs on the debate stage last night came from Hillary Clinton. The topic, things that Donald Trump has said about women. In particular, Clinton told the story of Alicia Machado, 1996 Miss Universe pageant winner from Venezuela, who says that Trump called her Miss Housekeeping and Miss Piggy after she gained weight. Trump basically let Clinton's attack slide at the debate, but he addressed it directly this morning on Fox and Friends and dug himself in even deeper.
And I know that person. That person was a Miss Universe person, and she was the worst we ever had. The worst, the absolute worst. She was impossible. And she was the winner, and, she gained a massive amount of weight, and it was a real problem.
The Clinton campaign is now trying to make those words a real problem for Donald Trump. Today, Machado, who is now a U.S. citizen, held a conference call with reporters and said she plans to do what she can to help Hillary Clinton get elected. And the Clinton campaign this morning sent out a 2-minute, highly produced web video of the former beauty queen telling her own story in Spanish. So, Mark, this is undeniably ugly, but do you think it will have lasting resonance with voters?
It has lasting resonance, or I think it will, with the media. I think it shows the Clinton campaign's sense of timing to bring real people to this front. The Trump campaign brought some real people out at the convention. We've not seen them since, reminiscent to the Romney campaign 4 years ago. They had some real people testifying on Mitt Romney's behalf at the convention. Then those people disappeared. So I think this goes right to the core of thematics: immigrants, women, Trump's temperament. So I don't know exactly how much this will hurt Trump, but given his reaction today, this one will have some legs for a while and will hurt him. And the Clinton people will send this message out, not just widely, but on a targeted basis.
Kellyanne Conway and others around Donald Trump recognized that he had a problem with suburban women. They've done various things to try to fix that problem. Donald Trump, by doing what he did, not the things he said in 1996, although those are bad, but by getting on television this morning and fat-shaming this woman, he has just basically just flown in the face of all of the work they've tried to do on his behalf. There is not a woman in the country, Republican, Democrat, anyone, who thinks it's okay for a man to get on television and say, you're the worst because you got fat.
I'll tell you another thing this shows about Trump's weakness as a candidate. You can bet that everyone out there who Hillary Clinton has intersected with, who might speak out against her, she knows the facts. She's having a response. Trump last night was like, where are you getting this information?
Right.
Well, it's been in the newspaper.
No kidding.
Where are they getting it?
No
They read
kidding.
the New York Times.
No
So
kidding.
the fact that he had no preparation for this, and as you said, his response both last night and then today in his interview with Fox News was to lash back out at her on just someone who
has done nothing to Donald Trump. Has done nothing about.
You don't need to know anything about her. Just on the basis of the facts as known, it's just foolish.
There's no excuse for it in any case, but in this case, this woman is just full of innocence in this case, and it's absurd.
She'll be back.
Yeah, she'll be back.
Better get a better answer, and probably this would be one of the times he should apologize. One debate down. There are 3 to go. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are going to face off again in a town hall session in St. Louis on October 9. Then 10 days after that, there's the third and final presidential debate in John's favorite Las Vegas, October 19th. But next up, there's the vice presidential debate. Mike Pence and Tim Kaine will hold their session in Farmville, Virginia, a week from today. So, John, how is last night's debate going to shape the contours of the Veep session and the 2 remaining presidential debates?
Well, I hate to keep going back to 2012, but you will remember very well after Barack Obama lost that first debate to Mitt Romney, it really amped the stakes up for the vice presidential debate, which also followed it. And so a lot of pressure on Joe Biden, a lot of pressure on Paul Ryan, but more on Biden. Now, that was probably because Democrats, as I said before, were panicking and Biden had to buck them up. That's not going to be the problem for Pence. I still think this vice presidential debate is going to be a snooze. We'll talk about the presidential one in a second.
Well, I think there's a little bit of pressure on Pence. It's comparable because the Republicans need to be buoyed, and he has been the buoyer-in-chief to the Republican Party in a lot of constituencies. And I think there's some pressure on Tim Kaine because he needs to keep things going. To me, the biggest factor now is Trump needs to win the second debate.
He does.
And it is a town hall.
Yes.
Trump has barely done town halls by himself, let alone this complexity of, people talk about, well, Trump needs to be more aggressive the next time. Being aggressive in a town hall, to me, if Trump doesn't prepare for this significantly more extensively, including like a 90-minute session with fake questioners, he is going to be committing malpractice.
And just pause on that for a second, because people don't kind of really necessarily think about this. It's one thing to say you're not going to do mock debates, which is dumb to say you're not going to do mock debates. This is a more complicated enterprise, as we've seen in debate perhaps past. Building a set that looks like the set, populating it with people playing real people, if not actual real people, to try to throw all of the kinds of questions out of left field. It's a totally different set of questions.
It's six-dimensional chess, and there is no such thing as six-dimensional
and it's
chess.
not.
That's how complicated it is.
It's not, you can try to predict what a moderator will ask, but you can't, it's a lot harder to predict what the American people will ask.
You can imagine Trump saying, I don't need to prepare. I know how to talk to real people. I've been doing it my whole life.
Yeah.
She will be as well practiced for this as she was
for last night. And the stakes are higher for him by a lot next time. All right, when we come back, Republican Congressman Tom Marino will tell us why he thinks that Donald Trump had a better night last night than we thought he did, right after this.
Welcome back. We're joined now by the Republican congressman from Pennsylvania, Tom Marino. He is a Trump supporter, and he comes to us from the Cannon Rotunda on Capitol Hill. Congressman, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Can you imagine that he might have hurt himself with some female voters when when the issue of things he said in the past about some women were raised?
You know, not necessarily. I'm sure there are some out there that were turned off by that. But look, Donald Trump is Donald Trump. And that's why he has the following that he has. It's a populist movement here. It's men, women, young people, you know, from all walks of life. So he was typical Donald Trump, and that's why he has won more votes in a primary in the history of this country than anyone else. And Hillary Clinton was the same old Hillary Clinton. You know, let's wrap it up nice and neat, but still continue to deny the issues concerning Benghazi, deny issues concerning her servers, and so on, and how great the country's doing. I found it absolutely amazing when she was bringing on how good a shape the country is, how safe it is. I can't remember 10, 15 years ago, other than 9/11, that we were having the shootings that we are having in this country because of a renegade Islamic extremist terrorism.
Congressman, did you have any problems hearing Mr. Trump last night?
No, I didn't.
Right. So so when Mr. Trump complained today about having a faulty microphone and maybe having been given a faulty microphone on purpose, you didn't have any difficulty discerning the words that are coming out of his mouth?
No, I have excellent hearing, and I had my TV on. I was in my office,
right,
and I was listening to it.
How did you think Lester Holt did as a moderator? Do you feel like he treated Mr. Trump fairly?
Absolutely not. I'm very disappointed in Holt. He didn't take Hillary Clinton on any issues. She had a one-liner on her server and her emails. I'm sorry it happened. If I had to do it over again, I would never do it. But then he went right back to Trump on the tax issues and statements that he's made. So I'm disappointed in Holt. I thought he was was different than that, but last night he really showed his bias.
Congressman, what do you think Donald Trump's most likely path is to 270 electoral votes? What states would it involve winning?
Pennsylvania, of course, where I'm from. I believe that if he wins Pennsylvania, he wins it. People are sick and tired of being sick and tired of the establishment. And I'm asked, why would I ever endorse him? And I just ask this rhetorical question. How's it been going the last 30 years with governors and senators and career politicians being president? No creating jobs, 20 trillion in debt, 20 million people out of work or underemployed, terrorism in the country, businesses are leaving. I want a person in there who's created tens of thousands of jobs, says what's on his mind. I don't agree with it all the time, but says what's on his mind and is not worried about being politically correct.
Congressman, Mark asked you a little bit earlier about female voters. It seems as though the comments that he made in the past about Miss Universe, he made some comments this morning that upset some people when he seemed to kind of be going back talking about her weight again. Again, you understand the importance of suburban women in your state if Pennsylvania is going to be winnable. Would you advise Mr. Trump to continue to talk about this in the way he does, or do you think that is potentially hugely problematic for him if he's going to win your state?
If he's going to win Pennsylvania, I want him, like he has been doing, sticking to the issues. Tell the American people, tell the people in Pennsylvania how he's going to improve the quality of their lives and how he's going to create jobs for them. If he sticks to that, he's got it made.
Congressman, just a short answer, if you would. Was Donald Trump everything you thought he needs to be to win the debates last night, or would you think he needs to improve for the next one?
I think he needs to be more aggressive. And I think he purposely backed off from that, but he's aware now that, no, he cannot do that because there's a bias in the fact that Clinton isn't taken to task on her issues, so he has to bring them up, even if he has to even if he has to interrupt the moderator, which he had to do last night because of the way that was being handled.
Okay, Congressman Marina from Capitol Hill. Congressman, thank you very much. President Obama's former campaign manager, Democratic strategist David Plouffe, joins us in a moment. We'll talk about the debate last night and about the Electoral College situation right after this.
I'm excited about where we are in this country. He talks down America every chance he gets. He calls us names. He calls us a third world country. He talks in such dire and dark terms. That's not who America is. You know, we are the best problem solvers in the world. Our diversity is a strength.
That was Hillary Clinton talking to reporters on her campaign plane today. We are joined now by a man who helped prep President Obama for a few debates of his own, and a man who now says that Hillary Clinton has a 100%, I repeat that, 100%, that means 0% a chance of winning the White House. That means a 0% chance of losing the White House. So we will now debut Mr. 100% David Plouffe. Welcome to our set.
Joe Namath-like.
So listen, here's the thing. 4 years ago, Barack Obama lost the first debate in Denver, and you, at the time and subsequently said, you know, he lost that first debate, but really the structure of the race didn't change very much. There was a little blip in the polling, but ultimately it leveled back out to where it was before. Why do we think that this debate victory for Hillary Clinton, if it is a victory, why do you think it will matter in terms of the actual outcome of the election?
I think there's two differences. So one, we were ahead going in that debate. I think she's ahead. So very different. So basically, we went on probation. You know, if we had lost the second debate, we would have been in deep trouble, I think. Second one is, I agree with Mark, I heard earlier, there was no oops moment, but there were still a lot of things Hillary Clinton can take out of that haul. You know, Donald Trump saying he was smart not to pay taxes, the Alicia Machado incident, some of what he said about Iraq. So Obama, we were really bad that night, but there was nothing other than a just bad 90-minute performance. There was not much for Romney to take out of that. So I think those are the two differences between 12 and now.
Is there a point at which the Clinton campaign can say, we've determined that the American people aren't going to find Donald Trump acceptable? Or is that a project that continues up?
It's got to continue every day. The two big missed moments left are obviously the two debates, but every day. I mean, I think part of what they need to do, and I think she did a good job of it today, is you've got to control the agenda every day as much as you can. And now, the town hall debate is a much different beast, and I don't think it's a natural home game for either one of them, actually.
You said you thought before this debate that it was 75% of what mattered remaining in the campaign. So obviously she did well last night. Everyone kind of agrees on that. What do you think the other 25% is between now and Election Day?
Right. Well, it's probably, you know, 15, 20% the other two debates, and then the rest is the execution of the campaign. And the one thing I know Hillary Clinton did last night was make Democrats, people weren't sure they're going to vote, more enthusiastic. I think she can add to that in the town hall. What I'd like to see in the town hall is really that connection.
How do you know that?
Well, because first of all, Democrats are easily panicked. And I think, you know, she looked strong. She took the fight to him. She talked a lot of progressive issues. So, and by the way, if that's all she did, I would have been pleased. But I think she probably did a decent amount of good with sort of moderate swing voters.
When campaigns are going poorly, particularly in your party, but also in the other party, people start to panic and they start to criticize. There's been a host of criticisms all three of us have heard over this tough period leading up to last night of the campaign. What are the criticisms that people are making of the Clinton campaign's workings, not just the candidate, and are they valid in any way?
I don't really think so. Listen, I've been through these. So, you know, you've got your valleys and your mountaintops, and when you're in a valley, it's no fun. You know, you can't do anything right.
Okay, but what are people saying about how the campaign, I know you're saying they're not true and you're an advisor to the campaign, but what are people saying about the Clinton campaign? They say it's not doing the right things. What are those things that they're saying?
Well, so I think there's two parts of a campaign. There's sort of the organizational side, and I have heard very little comment about that. The data, the analytics, the ground operation, are you funding that properly? Do you believe in it? Are you factoring that into your campaign strategy? I think in terms of, you know, the day-to-day sort of strategic part of the campaign, you know, obviously I think Jen Palmieri said they handled the illness inaccurately. So that was less, had they handled that better. But I think generally they're in a very good place. I think they've been super smart about the states they go to. And that's going to be interesting. Both of them now, I think the map has narrowed a little bit in my view. So how you apply resources and time is going to be really important.
We had our Bloomberg Politics national poll came out yesterday, and with millennial voters, Hillary Clinton was at about 40%. Donald Trump was about 30%. Barack Obama was at 60% in 2012. That's a 20-point gap between Hillary Clinton's current performance and your bosses, your former bosses. What does she need to do to fix that? How can she fix that? Can she fix that?
Right. So for instance, that's just a problem. That's not a campaign problem. That's a problem.
I understand, right.
And so I think that to me is still executing these two debates and figuring out how to both get your vote share up and get turnout up. That's the biggest thing happening.
But this is millennials in particular. What can she do to fix that problem if it can be fixed?
Well, so things like last night I think helped, right? For sure, that provides more energy to volunteers because the best way to get a millennial, and listen, there's a bunch of 18, 19, 20-year-olds that didn't vote for Barack Obama because they weren't eligible. So it's, you know, people in their 20s and this. You got to have a human being talk to them. They're not going to do it just because they see an ad. So it provided a little more energy, I think. And there's also a bunch of millennials that are choosing Johnson, and they've got to peel those off. So to me, this is the most important thing left in the campaign, is improving that. You're right. I mean, it's not a crisis, but it's a huge problem.
Is the Clinton campaign already thinking about, hey, if Johnson's vote is high, we may need to go after him in some way? You think they're already thinking?
I don't think going after him. I think it's more having the intelligence on who is either an undecided voter who's thinking about Johnson Clinton or who's soft Johnson. And now, I believe historically those third-party numbers do drift down. Yeah. But in a state like Colorado, it's still going to be pretty healthy. So it's an important part of the campaign.
And they may have to make the case not to go after him, but to say, don't waste your vote on him.
Right, if it's close. And that's the one benefit of it seeming close, I think, is that.
Right. All right. Okay, David Plouffe, you're going to stay here with us because we're going to map out some of the 2016 election battleground state math and the map after these words from our sponsors.
We are back with David Hundo P. Plouffe, man who says Hillary Clinton has a 100% chance of winning. So that means that no scenario that we could lay out to get Donald Trump to 270 electoral votes is something he would buy. So we thought we'd get David in here to look at those scenarios that the Republicans are talking about, citing them as a potential path to victory, and explain to us why they are not just implausible, but impossible. So let's look at the first one. This is the baseline here for any Trump win. The big three, Ohio, North Carolina, Florida. Even Democrats concede now Iowa is probably going to be a Trump state. So all the possible scenarios start with the big three plus Iowa. Now that doesn't get him all the way to 270, though. That gets him to 259. So let's look at the first scenario that could get Trump to 270, which would be adding in here Pennsylvania. The so-called Pennsylvania path, 279, doesn't need to win anything but the big three, Iowa and Pennsylvania. You could concede Trump could win the big three in Iowa. Could.
No.
Concede. Could. He can't.
So here's, I think Iowa, the two states he's doing best in are Iowa and Ohio.
Right.
But I still believe I'd rather be her than
I understand, but
both.
Is it implausible, impossible, I should say, that he wins Florida? Can't be impossible.
I think it's very unlikely.
But not impossible.
She's doing better right now in the campaign polling and the public polling than we ever did, and we won it twice. And the state has become more demographically friendly, so we'd win it by 2.5 now rather than the 1 just through shift alone.
All right, we got a lot of states too. Can he win North Carolina?
Yeah, I think, yeah,
He
lean
can.
Clinton,
He
could.
can. All right. So let's put our Florida
Right.
dispute aside. Say he could win it. Tell us why Pennsylvania is impossible for Trump.
It's the Easter Bunny, okay? It doesn't exist. He's going to walk out of southeastern Pennsylvania, Philly, and those 3 suburban counties, Delaware, Montgomery, Bucks. She's going to have north of 500,000 margin. There's just numerically not enough vote to pick up.
Has that state become more Democratic since 4 years ago?
So here's what I think. If Trump were a different candidate who had some appeal to suburban voters, I still think it would be hard for a Republican. The problem is it's like his Northern Virginia problem, his Denver suburb problem, and his Philadelphia suburb problem. It just, he can't get there. So could he get within 2 or 3? I think she wins at 4 or 5, yes, but he can't get to a win number.
Okay, let's look at scenario number 2 now. This is what we call the New Hampshire path. Again, it begins with the big 3 plus Iowa, and then you add in Nevada, New Hampshire, and the Maine 2nd district. That gets you right to 270 right there. Nevada, New Hampshire, and the 2nd district of Maine where you get 1 electoral vote.
I mean, of those, the 2nd district of Maine is probably the most plausible. I think she's going to win New Hampshire, I think, quite comfortably. I think that southern tier is kind of similar to what we just talked about in terms of Pennsylvania suburbs outside of Philly, Virginia. And I think Nevada, at the end of the day, I know the polls are going to be close. Ours were relatively close because of the Latino vote there.
But what you say makes this scenario impossible is
New Hampshire, Nevada.
Right.
Yeah, I think if I'd ranked them, I think she's certain to win New Hampshire, in my view.
As long as we're talking about this, though, just explain to me why Barack Obama won Nevada comfortably both times. Won it by a lot in 2008, won it comfortably in 2012. Why is she behind in polling in Nevada with all the Hispanics there?
There's some polls that show it like 40-38, okay? 78% of the people aren't going to vote. 100% of the people are going to vote. And see, this is where I think the race is. Donald Trump he may be at a ceiling, but he's closer to a ceiling than she is. She's got more vote to come in. She's going to win more of the undecided vote, in my view. The third-party vote is going to collapse a little bit. She's going to get more of that. And you even see in some of these polls, you have Latino undecided vote huge. So that's why I think she's Nevada. Listen, our own polling in Nevada was never as rosy as the ultimate election outcome.
All right, let's look at 3 last scenarios that I'm sure you're, as we know, you're by definition going to say can't happen. One is involves Colorado. No chance there. That's got the kind of voters.
So what you're saying is this includes him winning Florida. Okay.
Every scenario.
All the scenarios have the big 3 and Iowa.
No, right. Colorado, I don't see it all. I think she wins at 4 to 5 points.
All right, what about winning the silver state in Wisconsin? Get him to 275.
Wisconsin's going to be a Clinton state. So is Michigan. So is Minnesota. I mean, the Democratic strength up in the upper Midwest. Now, Barack Obama had unique strength there both times, but I just don't see it happening.
Unique strength because of the African-American vote.
Well, no, because, he was from Illinois,
right?
And it was really interesting. That was always an underappreciated. We didn't have to spend much time and money up there. Wisconsin was a little closer in 12 because of Ryan.
Right. So why Colorado right now the polling is really close there, and Gary Johnson's getting a big chunk of that vote. Why is that? Why are you so sure?
Well, there was 1 or 2 polls that had it close.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So again, I think if you look at modeling out 100% of the electorate, if you look at even the aggregation of most public polls, that may be one of Johnson's best states. I don't think he's going to get 12 or 14. And again, I think that she's going to absolutely mambo him with a Latino vote in Colorado. And you add suburban swing voters, which I think she's going to win in a dominating way, maybe even more than we won in 12 and 8. Well, certainly in 12.
Right, but as you said before, the map has narrowed. And as the Trump campaign basically has as a proposition, perhaps at the end, pick 2 of these scenarios and just say, oh, go all in. Trump could do a week-long bus tour in Pennsylvania, right? Or whatever, Wisconsin, whatever they choose, right? So what happens?
Because Florida and
I understand. I'm not saying just that state, but I'm saying basically you could. These combinations involved. Let's assume Iowa and Ohio are safe. Not for sure, but let's.
I think she's going to win them both. I really
understand,
do.
but let's.
Iowa and Ohio.
Yes, I do.
Iowa and Ohio.
The campaign, your campaign is a little bit less optimistic about those. But let's just say we get down to the end, the last 3 weeks, and he's got those pretty well secured. Then he basically could campaign in 4 states, right? He could campaign in Florida, North Carolina, and then any 2 that get him over the top. At that point, you're basically running for governor of 4 states at the same time.
Well, he may show up.
He could pour money in, right? Republican allies could come in.
He could show up. He doesn't have much of an organization. And again, the
Republican Party has an organization.
It's not the same as a candidate.
I understand. I agree with that. But all I'm saying is, in the end, you're saying now, you look at the national map, he can't get to 270. But isn't it impossible to say what happens if a guy who's willing to maybe drop a lot of money just to saying basically I'm going in 4 states for 3 weeks?
No, because you're basically, the product matters here, and he's a flawed product. I mean, that's again where my confidence comes in. This guy, in my view, is not going to be elected president, and he's got a ceiling.
And your basic argument is that the premise here, he's not going to win all 4 of those states.
No,
That's what you're saying.
no. I think she's going to win all 4, but Florida and North Carolina, I would much rather be her. Iowa and Ohio are the toughest.
All right, David Plouffe, we are 100% certain we will see you again on the program. Thanks for coming in.
Joe Namath Plouffe.
If you're watching this program in Washington, D.C., there is a 100% chance you can listen to it on the radio. It's at Bloomberg 99.1 FM, the nation's capital, and we will be right back.
With us now for some more debate about last night's debate, MSNBC political correspondent Casey Hunt, who follows the Clinton campaign, and NBC News correspondent Kate Turr, who follows the Trump campaign and comes to us from Melbourne, Florida, where Trump will be holding a rally later tonight. Casey, we asked this question earlier in the show. What will the Clinton campaign do to capitalize on her strong debate performance last night? What is the campaign saying about that?
Look, I think the thing that has stood out to me most in the last 24 hours is Hillary Clinton's demeanor. She has come across as loose and relaxed. She turned around, kind of threw a comment over her shoulder as reporters were shouting questions at her on the press plane. That's not something that she does. She has not typically shown kind of ease and willingness to kind of banter around in those types of situations, and she is. And I think if she can hang on to that confidence that clearly she's taken away from this stage, it'll make a real difference.
And in fact, maybe it will allow her to answer hard questions if she takes them, right? I mean, the questions were mostly easy, but that style, that attitude seems to me will lend itself perhaps to her getting through the inevitable rough periods that come up if she can sustain it through that.
I think that's right. And I think that you saw, her answer last night, and the debate did not get into her emails terribly much, but where it did, she gave basically factually the same answer she's given, but the tone that she used to give it was markedly different. And I think if she continues in that vein as well, that's a place where they could see some success.
Katie, as you've talked to Trump advisors behind the scenes, I'm wondering if you've had the experience we've had, which some of them, unlike Mr. Trump and the public spokespeople, acknowledged that last night was not his finest hour.
No, last night was not what they wanted. They wanted a more what they would call presidential Trump, the Trump that went down to Mexico and met with the Mexican president, if you will, not a Trump that went on the attack unnecessarily. They said that they were expecting Hillary Clinton to come at him. They were expecting her to try and knock him off his game. They said he was ready for that. Clearly, though, he wasn't. I mean, what they're trying to do, guys, and you know this, is expand his base. His supporters are with him no matter what. They're not going to leave him. But he needs to find a way to get those moderate Republicans, the women, to come into his camp. And to do that, he's got to seem like a less risky choice. Hillary Clinton keeps calling him basically a scary choice. He's got to prove to them that he's not. At the very least, keep them from voting for Hillary Clinton. Last night, though, he was erratic. He was interrupting her. I think he interrupted her 29 times. She interrupted him 9 times. He made a bunch of factual errors and a lot of misstatements, and he didn't come off as somebody who can let something slide. So this was not their finest hour. Obviously, they're trying to put a public face on this. They're trying to use it to their advantage by saying that he's a unique candidate. That's what Paul Ryan said today, and calling Hillary Clinton canned and staged and over-practiced and scripted. So they're trying to spin it in their favor, but it's hard to see how that debate performance really gets them any new supporters.
Casey, David Plouffe just made the point. You know, there's various things Trump said last night that the Clinton campaign can try to capitalize on and try to exploit. Among the many things that Trump said that might be problematic, where does the campaign think they can get mileage out of mistakes he made, given they didn't have an oops moment?
I think there's a couple things. I think what he had to say about the housing crisis is one. I think what he had to say about the birtherism issue to people of color is another. But I think what happened with Miss Universe is probably the one thing, and you guys were talking about this, you know, the election being so much about particularly suburban women. And I think, you know, you saw her very deliberately kind of try and get that in a little bit kind of at the end. It was clear that it was important to her to do it. And I think the way you've seen them just push on that today, I think even they were a little bit surprised that he went as far as he did in essentially defending himself, you know, doubling down, repeating himself, not to use a phrase that you guys have entered into our lexicon anyway. But, you know, I think that that's something that they think has staying power.
I want to ask you both about the next debate. Casey, you first. She took a lot of time off the trail, as she pointed out, to practice and prepare. There are fewer days now to Election Day. Do you expect her to have a lot of down days to prepare for the next debate, or to be more like Trump and to be out there campaigning with some practice on the side?
I think, look, my sense is that they do feel like they need to make sure that she is out there on the one hand, but I think they think it's very important that they balance that with making sure she gets enough rest, frankly.
Katie, any indication that Trump will practice more for the next debate, and given what he did last night?
The campaign wants him to practice more. They tried to get him to practice more for this debate, but they admit that it's hard to get him to focus on the issues, to get him to focus on any one thing. That's why you see him campaigning, because he's a guy that always likes to be on the go. And I will tell you this, I mean, he was shown videotape of himself from the past debates, from the primary debates, to kind of show him where he needed to improve for the general election. And he thought every answer he gave was perfect back then. So there wasn't really a lot of room to tell him that he could have done something better, because he refused to see it. Will this be a wake-up call for him? We're going to have to see. When he was down in the polls, we did start to see him get it together more. We saw him on prompter more. If this results in a downturn in the polls, then I would expect that he's going to take it a little bit more seriously. But if these polls remain the same, and if it remains neck and neck, and he sees a reason not to change, I can't imagine Donald Trump's going to be a different candidate than he's been for the past 16 months.
Katie, I want you to put on your psychoanalyst hat. I mean, you spent a lot of time exploring the psyche of Donald J. Trump. Do you think that his mentions of the microphone, the moderator, the excuses he made today, does that not, in your view, signify at least some kind of tacit acceptance of the notion that he did not perform all that well last night and that he lost the debate?
I mean, he might be trying to convince himself that he performed well and that everybody's out against him, everyone's out to get him, that the mic wasn't good and Lester wasn't good. Last night he said Lester was a good moderator. Today he's saying that he lobbed unfair questions at him. But this is the same thing he did during the primaries, guys. He would come out, declare himself the winner, talk about all these online polls that he won. But then at the same time, he would be calling out the refs, calling out the moderators, calling out Megyn Kelly, calling out his opponents, saying everybody's being unfair to him. He didn't get enough time time. He got too much time. The questions were too focused on him. He didn't get enough questions. So this is the same thing we've been seeing over and over again. I expect even if he did a wonderful job last night, he would still say that there was something wrong because it is part of his narrative. It's part of who he is. He's running against the establishment and everybody else, frankly, from the media to the moderators to the microphone to Hillary Clinton, is the establishment.
All right, Katie Tur in Melbourne,
Microphone
Florida.
is the establishment.
The microphone is the establishment. That's a whole new Marshall McLuhan-like phrase. Casey Hunt.
I said it first.
Thank you guys for both being here. You're wonderful and fabulous, and we'll be right back.
Full credit, Katie.
There is all the post-debate coverage you could possibly want right now on our website, BloombergPolitics.com. There's a special edition of Surveillance Primetime next. John, tomorrow, the next day of the next day, what are you looking for?
Hillary Clinton goes to New Hampshire tomorrow. She's going to be up there with Bernie Sanders talking about college affordability. David Plouffe just basically said the millennial problem is a real, huge problem for Hillary Clinton. That's one step towards trying to solve it.
And I talked to a lot of Sanders supporters who say we don't care who he's for. We'll make up our own minds. Thanks for watching. We'll be back here tomorrow night, same bad time, same bad channel. Until then, sayonara.